topic today is examining our God talk. Something we all need to do from time to time, I think, in order to make sure that we really know what we're talking about, right? What do we really mean when we choose to use the word God? For example, a couple of weeks ago on Super Bowl Sunday, I mentioned that there are a lot of people in this country who believe that God had a favorite team in the big game. And lots of football players seem to know what they mean when they use the word God. For example, right? They point to the sky, or even better, they drop to one knee or both knees and point to the sky when they make a big play, right? And you have to think that while that image of God, the image of God that helped them to make that big play, while that was happening, while God was busy helping them with that play, there were innocent children dying of starvation, disease, or abuse somewhere in the world. Yeah. When you put it in that context, it kind of seems like a meaningless gesture, doesn't it? Then again, maybe it wasn't an empty gesture. Maybe this was simply meant to be a humble expression of gratitude. You see, we don't know what those football players are really thinking, do we? We don't know unless they choose to tell us. And I think that's kind of the point. Maybe they meant that gesture to be profound. But in many ways it looks meaningless, especially in the context of all the suffering that we know is in the world. It's all a question of what you mean by God. And that can differ. I really like what Carl Sagan once said on this topic. He wrote a book called Broca's Brain. And here's what he says. Because the word God means many things to many people, I frequently reply to people who ask, "Do you believe in God?" by asking them what the questioner means by God. To my surprise, this response is often considered puzzling or unexpected. Oh, you know, God. Everyone knows who God is. Or, well, kind of a force that is stronger than we are and that exists everywhere in the universe. Well, there are a number of such forces. One of them is called gravity, but it is not often identified with God. And not everyone does know what is meant by God. Whether we believe in God depends very much on what we mean by God. So that's why we need to examine our God talk. You've probably heard the story about a group of first grade kids during art class. One of the little girls is really getting into the project, and the teacher goes over to check on her, and she's busy drawing something, and she asks the little girl, "Well, what are you drawing?" And the little girl doesn't even look up. She just says, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher says, "Well, that's nice, dear, but you do realize that nobody actually knows what God looks like." And the little girl doesn't miss a beat, and she says, "They will when I'm finished." She's pretty sure, isn't she? What do we mean by God? That's the question. What does our own picture of God look like? In Unity, I like to say that within reasonable limits, you can have it your way, which is something that I rather irreverently call Burger King spirituality. You remember that campaign for Burger King? Have it your way. So when it comes to an image or a definition of God, we give people a lot of leeway. You can have it your way, but we have to be careful because that doesn't mean that anything goes. We don't want to give any support to the kind of God we find in the Hebrew Scriptures. And believe me, there are plenty of people who, when they use the word God, that's what they mean. The God who commanded genocide and racial purity and all sorts of things like that, or a God who cares about football games and elections more than dying children. This God that represents, that resembles sort of a supernatural kind of human entity, all right? We don't want to support that. We want to be very clear about what we mean when we use the word God. And that brings me to our prayer for protection in unity. The light of God surrounds us, the love of God enfolds us, and so on and so on. At first glance, you think about it, it can sound sort of anthropomorphic, like we're projecting human qualities when we use the word God. It can also seem maybe a bit dualistic, like we're separating out this entity called God and having it stand apart and in many cases above us, but either way it's somewhere out there and apart, dualism. And yet here we use it here each week, and that's along with hundreds of other unity centers around the world. It's not required, but it's become a custom. It's become a ritual. Dare I say, a sacred cow in some ways. Now I'm going to bet probably that most of you don't know the history of the prayer for protection. And I think it might be helpful to review how it came about. Because in the grand scheme of things, it's not all that old. It was written by a guy named James Dillett Freeman. He was a very well-known unity minister. He used to be the director of Silent Unity, and he was also the director of the Unity Ministerial School. But he was best known as being the poet laureate of the Unity movement. He wrote the Prayer for Protection. And this all started back in the year 1940. Jim Freeman was asked to write a special Christmas prayer service for the workers at Silent Unity, and that's our worldwide telephone prayer ministry. Now, think about Christmas time, 1940. The United States wasn't quite at war yet, but it was raging in Europe and many other places, and everyone knew that it was just a matter of time before the rest of the world, including the United States, became involved in what would become World War II. So this is how Jim Freeman described the process. He said, we had never before needed a prayer for protection, but in 1940, we needed one. So I wrote one to go with the Christmas service, and what I wrote was a little 4-line verse. The light of Christ directs me, the love of Christ enfolds me, the power of Christ protects me, the presence of Christ upholds me. So there it is. That's the first draft of the prayer for protection. And after that, then Silent Unity asked him to write a pamphlet to go along with it, a pamphlet that they could send out to people that would contain that prayer plus other affirmative prayers. And so he wrote one, a little pamphlet that was called His Protecting Spirit. And it included Psalm 23. You know the one, right? Walking through the valley of the shadow of death, that one. Now by this time, you might have noticed a little bit of a trend. First, there is a definite masculine bias there in the language that's being used. And there is a definite Judeo-Christian bias there, which really, considering the year 1940, should come as no surprise because it was an entirely different culture in this country and in Unity as well. Fortunately, though, they had some very good editors at Silent Unity, and someone who had been reading the draft of the pamphlet came up to Jim Freeman and said, Jim, if I were a woman in England and they were dropping bombs on my roof, or if I were a soldier and someone was pointing a loaded gun at me, I wouldn't want to feel like I was walking through the valley of the shadow of death. In other words, lighten up, right? He says, can't you do better than that? So this is when the new version of the prayer for protection came through to him. The version of the prayer that he wrote for Silent Unity at Christmas took on a new form. The new one went like this. The light of God surrounds me. The love of God enfolds me. The power of God protects me. The presence of God watches over me. That's it. He said he changed the word Christ to God so that it would be a little more of an interfaith prayer, appealing to more people. And that's the way it was first printed in 1941, just those 4 lines. Then, when the second printing came around in 1943, he added the 5th line that's so familiar to us, that last line which says, "Wherever I am, God is." Thousands of soldiers and civilians carried that around with them during World War II. And it's endured long afterwards, so it's not something we want to take lightly. In more recent times, this is Buzz Aldrin, famous astronaut. He carried it with him on Apollo 11 when he became the second person to walk on the moon. Those of you who are familiar with and fans of Good Morning America on ABC, you might remember the anchor person, Robin Roberts. A few years back, she told her audience that the prayer for protection was her daily morning prayer. And she talked about how it helped her to get through all of the medical procedures. And you remember that time, she was going through a lot of medical procedures to get through her fight with breast cancer, I believe it was. So she took the prayer for protection and she turned it into these bracelets here. You might remember that. They were kind of making a splash back then. The bracelets have the words light, love, power, and presence on them. Got a lot of attention, but nobody ever made the unity connection, which is kind of unfortunate, but I guess that means that we just have to trust in karma, I guess, because it's not so much a matter of getting credit for it as it is seeing the good that this accomplished. It's real. Now, y'all may be aware, some of you may be aware, that in many Unity Centers there's a 6th line that was added to the prayer for protection, the one that says, "And all is well." Jim Freeman didn't write it. And for a while there, he was a little bit, shall we say, a bit unhappy that people were tinkering with it and adding that line to it. But as time went on, his attitude, I think, was basically, well, you know, whatever. He learned to live with it, but we don't use it here because we prefer to stick with it as it was written and as it was intended. So, how's the prayer for protection holding up these days? How well is it standing the test of time? Because it does, as I mentioned earlier, it does seem to describe God as maybe a human-like being out there who sends down light, love, power, protection, the light of God, the love of God, and so on. And that's not so bad, but then when we get to the line that says the presence of God is watching over us, those seem to be very human attributes, and maybe they're at odds with some of our basic teachings. For example, one of the earliest and clearest definitions of what we mean by the word God comes from a book called Lessons in Truth. This was written by Emily Cady, and it was compiled back in the late 1800s. So here's a couple of things that she has to say about the God concept. She says, God is spirit, or the creative energy that is the cause of all visible things. God as spirit is the invisible life and intelligence underlying all physical things. That's pretty darn good. That's been happening since the late 1800s. God is not a being or person having life, intelligence, love, power. God is that invisible, intangible, but very real something we call life. It's Lessons in Truth. One of the things we have to remember, I think, is that Jim Freeman, he was a poet, not a theologian. He was a poet. I think he has more in common with a Zen master presenting a koan to us. And maybe we can even think of the prayer for protection from the perspective of poetic naturalism, which we've been talking about here lately. Of course, there's no God-man in the sky out there sending stuff to us or watching over us like a security guard or maybe Santa Claus. It's a metaphor. It's symbolism. And human beings think in terms of metaphors and symbols all the time. Emily Cady recognized that. She recognized that we think in terms of symbols, that we tend to personify things. That's what we do. She wrote something else in Lessons in Truth that captures that truth, that reality, that we speak in metaphor and symbol and tend to personify things. She said, God is the name we give to that unchangeable, inexorable principle at the source of all existence. To the individual consciousness, God takes on personality. But as the creative underlying cause of all things, he is principle, impersonal, and as expressed in each individual, he becomes personal to that one. A personal, loving, all-forgiving mother, father, if you choose to think of principle in that way. So, getting back to my Burger King theology, as I irreverently like to put it, that's how you can have it your way. God can be principle and personal without being a person. God can be principle and personal without being a person. Now, if you want a more modern take on all of this, here's something that Reverend Michael Dowd had to say on the subject. This is from his book, Thank God for Evolution. Now, that's a book we were talking about just last week. So here's what he has to say about it. Birth, life, death, the cycles and rhythms of nature, the elemental forces of the universe. These are inescapably real. Like it or not, we have always found ourselves in relationship with a reality we could neither predict nor control. And given the nature of the human brain, there is one thing that people in every culture and throughout history have instinctively done. We've used metaphors and analogies to refer and relate to that which is unavoidably, undeniably real and or mysterious. Indeed, it seems that we can't not do this. Human beings, we have this instinctive need to, what we're doing essentially is we're personifying reality. We have this instinctive need to personify reality in order to be able to relate to it on a human level. In order to be able to relate to it in any way that makes sense to us. And that includes personifying the concept of God. I like to say that my concept of God is reality personified. That works for me. But here's what we have to be careful of. We have to be careful that we don't cling to the personification, that we don't cling to the metaphor and get stuck there. If we cling to the personification, if we cling to the metaphor and insist that it's the absolute truth, then we're going to have some conflict. It's going to cause problems. On the other hand, that doesn't mean we have to go to the opposite extreme and throw it all out, including the prayer for protection, because maybe we can quibble about whether it comports with Emily Cady's earliest definition of God. That's not what we're about. The neat thing, the really great thing about symbolic personifications like the prayer for protection is that they're easy to memorize. That's important. We're trying to communicate. We want to get the message across. It's easy to memorize and it'll fit neatly in your pocket, just like it did for soldiers on the battlefield, an astronaut on the moon, or a woman going through chemo and bone marrow transplants. It's extremely valuable. The prayer for protection is the mythical, symbolic language that's trying to capture a greater truth using shorthand. That's how it works. The prayer for protection is mythical, symbolic language that's trying to capture a greater truth. And once again, Emily Cady, we get back to her, she describes this greater truth in a little more detail for us. Also from Lessons in Truth. She says, The ultimate aim of every man should be to come into the consciousness of an indwelling God, and then in all external matters to affirm deliverance through and by this divine one. There should not be a running to and fro, making human efforts to aid the divine, but a calm, restful, unwavering trust in all wisdom and all power within one, as able to accomplish the thing desired. I've added the emphasis up there. I added the italics and the bold print because those are the key ideas here. And there's nothing inconsistent between that and the prayer for protection, so long as we see the prayer for protection as an interpretive stepping stone that we can use to help us to arrive at that calm, unwavering trust, which, by the way, is my definition of faith, trusting what we know to be true, that calm, unwavering trust in principle that the symbolic language is pointing to. It's a tool that can point the way, but it's not meant to be absolute truth in itself. So the takeaway here is that mythical language, poetry, metaphor is always an invitation to go deeper, to go beyond the superficial meaning of the words, and eventually maybe to be able to let go of the words altogether at the level of consciousness and to trust the experience that they're trying to capture, the reality that they're trying to capture symbolically. So when we think about our prayer for protection, maybe we can ponder as we go home, what does it mean for light to surround us, for love to enfold us, for power to protect us, for a presence? What is it that seems to guide us and show us the way and help us to have that sense of safety and security? What do we mean when we say, wherever I am, God is? What do the words I am and God is juxtapose next to each other? What does that really mean? You could sit with that in meditation for a long time and have a very deep experience. I am, God is. So I've given you a lot of information to work with. It's in the insert in your bulletin, these quotes and different things. Try working with it this week. See if maybe we might be able to come to a little more clarity on what it means when we use the word God. Let's all examine our God talk this week and see what that does for us. And I'll see you next week. Thank you.